In the heart of winter, when most men would have abandoned hope, an Amish carpenter's foolish idea to fix his chimney became the one thing that saved him. His cabin stood strong against the harshest conditions, proving that sometimes the simplest solutions are the most powerful. Before we begin, share where you're watching from, and if tales of faith, craftsmanship, and quiet ingenuity speak to your heart, join us for tomorrow's story. It was the winter of 1876, and snow had fallen for 3 days straight over the Lancaster County hills. The wind howled in gusts, biting through the thin walls of John Lapp's cabin, pushing the fire's warmth into the corners. The land around him was silent, blanketed beneath a thick layer of white. His house, built with precision and care as every Amish cabin was, stood firm, but it was not enough to fight the cold of a relentless winter storm. The chimney, a proud feature of his craftsmanship, had begun to falter. The very thing that brought him warmth now threatened to rob him of it. It had started with a slight draft, which John thought little of, until the cold became unbearable, and the fire in the hearth began to dim. No matter how much wood he fed the fire, the heat dissipated too quickly, and the chill crept deeper into the bones of the cabin. The smoke no longer billowed from the chimney in the steady rhythm it once had. Instead, a thin stream curled lazily upward, fading into the air. His once perfect chimney was clogged, a symbol of his meticulous work now undone by the very season he tried to outlast. The isolation was the hardest part. John had no neighbors to consult, no one who could offer advice, only the howling wind and the snow that threatened to bury him beneath its weight. Most men would have given up, seeking solace in the warmth of their homes or perhaps abandoning the cabin for better shelter, but not John. He was a man who believed in the power of simplicity, in the value of doing what was right, even when the answer was not immediately obvious. He knew this problem could be solved. All he needed was time and faith. He sat by the fire, watching it weaken, until his mind clicked into focus. The chimney would need to be rebuilt. But instead of simply repairing the smoke passage as most men would, John had an idea, one that seemed foolish to his neighbors if they knew about it. It would take time, hard work, and patience, but in the end, it might just be the thing that would keep him warm through the long winter. With a final glance at the crackling embers, John stood, pulled his coat tight, and stepped outside. The cold hit him like a wall, but he was undeterred. The first steps of his plan were simple enough: gather stones. He would rebuild the chimney, not just to restore its function, but to fortify it, giving it more strength, more warmth than before. He would make it a fortress against the unforgiving winter winds. As the days turned into weeks, the snow outside continued to fall. John Lapp, with his broad shoulders and weathered hands, worked tirelessly each morning to gather stones. His neighbors, from their warm homes, watched him with amusement. "A man of faith and foolishness," they would whisper, shaking their heads. After all, what kind of man took on such a massive project when there was no guarantee it would even work? But John never wavered. There was a quiet strength in his actions, a faith in his hands that spoke louder than words ever could. As he gathered each stone from the frozen ground, he would whisper a prayer under his breath, asking for strength and guidance. He believed in the goodness of simplicity, and in this moment, he was determined to create something that would endure. The task was harder than he anticipated. As the days stretched on, his body began to grow weary. But still he worked. He cut the stones with an old chisel, shaping each one to fit the gaps in his design. His hands were stiff from the cold, but his resolve was unshaken. He did not just build a chimney, he was constructing a piece of survival, a testament to his faith and ingenuity. The stones, once cold and distant, began to form a new structure, one that would carry warmth back into the cabin. As he worked, John found that his fix was more than a mere repair. It was a reinvention. The chimney began to glow with a light he had not seen in weeks. The fire, once weak and fading, now burned brighter, the heat radiating through the thick stone walls. John's foolish idea was proving to be more than just a fix. It was, in fact, the key to his survival. Each night, as he sat by the fire, the warmth embraced him, just as it had when the cabin was first built. The quiet strength of his work, the love of his craft, filled the room. The storm raged outside, but within the cabin there was peace. John Lapp's simple, stubborn faith had paid off. His cabin, once on the verge of freezing him out, now stood strong against the fiercest winter the county had ever known. And through it all, John realized something deeper. Sometimes, the simplest solutions to life's hardest challenges are the ones born from silence, patience, and faith. As winter stretched on, the storm's fury seemed to know no end. Days turned into weeks, and the snow kept falling, as if the sky itself were refusing to surrender. The world outside John's cabin had become a bleak, endless white. But inside, there was a different story. The fire crackled steadily in the hearth, the warmth filling the room in gentle waves. Each evening, John sat by the fire, watching the flames dance and listening to the wind's mournful song outside. Despite the bitter cold, there was a soft comfort in knowing that his cabin was holding firm, that his chimney, a labor of love and determination, was keeping the warmth alive. Each log he placed on the fire was a small victory, and as the days passed, he grew stronger, more certain that he had made the right choice. One cold morning, as the sun rose weakly over the horizon, a familiar sound echoed from the direction of the nearby farm. John looked out through the frosted window, his breath fogging up the glass as he squinted into the distance. A figure, bundled in heavy winter clothes, was making its way toward his cabin. It was Abram Miller, a neighbor whose homestead sat a few miles down the ridge. Abram had been among the first to mock John's work, calling his efforts excessive and unnecessary. Now Abram was trudging through the deep snow with a sled loaded with firewood. His face, though red from the cold, bore the lines of worry. John opened the door to greet him, letting the warmth from the cabin spill out into the frigid morning air. Abram's breath came in short bursts as he spoke, his voice laced with a mix of respect and relief. "John, I've come to ask if I can borrow some firewood," Abram said, his eyes flicking nervously to the heavy snow that seemed to press in from every direction. "We've been struggling. The wind is so strong, it feels like it's cutting right through the walls." John didn't hesitate. He motioned for Abram to come inside, and the man stepped into the warmth of the cabin, his posture immediately relaxing. As Abram stood by the fire, warming his hands, John looked at him, seeing the quiet desperation in his eyes. "You built your cabin for the worst, didn't you?" Abram asked, his voice quieter now, almost sheepish. John nodded, a slight smile tugging at his lips. "I did. I've been thinking about that," Abram continued, his voice more certain now. "I thought you were foolish, but now I see what you were doing. I should have taken more time, like you did." "I won't make the same mistake again." John watched as Abram began to relax, the tension leaving his shoulders. He didn't need to say much. His actions had already spoken louder than words could. His cabin, built with care and faith, had become a beacon of warmth and hope in the midst of the relentless storm. Abram, once a skeptic, had seen the truth. And in that moment, John knew that the small sacrifices he had made, the hours spent chiseling stones, the patience to build something right, had made all the difference. Days passed, and with each one, John's cabin became a place of refuge, not just for him but for the others who found their way to his doorstep. Word spread through the nearby settlements that John Lapp's cabin was a safe haven against the storm's wrath. One by one, his neighbors came, some in search of firewood, others simply needing shelter from the biting cold. It wasn't long before John's modest cabin became a gathering place, where families huddled together, sharing food, stories, and the warmth that only a well-built home could provide. John never turned anyone away. The simple act of kindness, of offering what little he had, became a part of his daily routine. There was no pride in his actions, no desire for recognition. For him, survival was more than just about enduring the winter. It was about taking care of his neighbors, showing them that in times of hardship, faith and community could triumph over fear and isolation. One evening, as John sat beside the hearth, a man entered, his face drawn with exhaustion. It was Samuel Burkhardt, a farmer from the next township over, his clothes caked in snow, his breath shallow from the cold. "I heard you might be able to help," Samuel said, his voice hoarse. "My family. We've run out of food and firewood. We're at the edge of losing everything." John stood, his heart heavy with compassion. Without a word, he led Samuel to the pantry, where he kept his reserves of food. He filled a sack with dried meat, bread, and preserved vegetables, handing it to Samuel with a quiet nod. "You'll make it through," John said softly, his gaze steady. "Just hold on. You're not alone." Samuel's eyes welled with tears as he took the sack. "Thank you, John. I don't know what we would have done without you." John gave a humble smile, patting Samuel's back before turning to gather more firewood for him. The fire in the hearth crackled warmly as the two men worked together, the flames casting long shadows across the cabin. In that simple act of giving, John realized that this was what survival truly meant. It wasn't about sheltering oneself from the cold. It was about sharing what you had, about finding warmth not just in the fire, but in the company of others. By the time Samuel left, the storm outside had grown even fiercer. But inside, there was peace, a quiet, steady peace that came from knowing that no matter how long the storm lasted, the bonds of community, faith, and love would endure. As the storm raged on into February, the world outside John Lapp's cabin seemed to have fallen into an endless hush, broken only by the howl of the wind and the distant creaking of the trees. The snow had deepened, the drifts becoming so high that it was nearly impossible to see beyond a few feet. The township was nearly cut off entirely, with the railroad still buried under the snow, the trains unable to break through the thick, frozen landscape. But within the walls of John's cabin, there was warmth, and there was stillness, a stillness born not from silence, but from the peace of knowing that no matter how fierce the storm outside, those who had sought refuge inside were safe. It wasn't just the fire that kept them warm. It was the unspoken understanding that came from sharing a space of humility, of faith. John had become more than just the man who had saved his own life. He had become the pillar of the community, the quiet heart that kept everything beating. He had shared what he had without asking for anything in return, and for that, the community had found something they had almost forgotten: hope. One evening, as John and his neighbors gathered around the fire to share supper, Abram Miller, who had been one of the first to mock John's building methods, spoke up. He had watched how John's careful design had kept everyone alive, how his small acts of charity had sustained them all. Now, as he looked around at the faces of those gathered in the warmth of the cabin, he realized that they were all there because of one man's decision to build not just for the winter he knew, but for the one he feared. "You know," Abram began, his voice quiet but sure, "when I first saw John's chimney, I thought he'd lost his mind. I thought, what a fool. But I see now. I see what he did, and I realize that it wasn't foolish at all. It was the smartest thing any of us could have done." John, ever humble, looked around the room, his gaze softening with the warmth of the fire. "I wasn't trying to be smart," he said quietly. "I just wanted to make sure we could all make it through." But his words hung in the air, and Abram's acknowledgement settled on him like a blanket. It wasn't about being right or proving others wrong, it was about saving lives. John had known the value of patience and perseverance. He had built his cabin for more than just himself. He had built it for his community, for the ones who might not have understood, but who would eventually come to realize the depth of his care. That night, as the fire crackled softly and the storm continued to rage outside, John Lapp allowed himself to close his eyes in quiet satisfaction. The season was long from over, but he had already received his reward. It wasn't gold or recognition, but something far more precious: the safety and well-being of his neighbors, his friends, and his family. By early spring, the storm had passed, and the ground had begun to thaw. The cabin, though still buried under layers of snow, had stood firm through the winter's trials. John's chimney was a testament to the kind of man he was, a quiet, steadfast soul who had known what was needed before anyone else had even considered it. He had built not for himself, but for the future, for the unknown hardships that might come. His foresight had turned out to be not only wise, but life-saving. As the snow melted and the land slowly awakened from its long winter slumber, the community began to rebuild, starting with the lessons they had learned in the harshest of circumstances. Word spread far beyond Lancaster County about the man who had been prepared for the worst, and how his efforts had saved so many lives. People who had laughed at his plans, who had called him a fool, now approached him with respect, seeking advice, seeking the kind of wisdom they had not understood when they were too busy mocking him. One afternoon in April, as the sun cast long shadows across the fields, John stood outside his cabin, looking over the land he had worked for so many years. The cabin, though worn and weathered, remained as strong as it had been when he first built it. But more importantly, it stood as a symbol of endurance, a symbol of what could be achieved when patience, faith, and careful planning were allowed to lead the way. As he walked along the ridge, Abram Miller joined him, this time without the air of mockery that had once been present in his tone. Instead, there was a deep respect in his voice as he spoke. "John," Abram said, his eyes taking in the cabin's strong outline against the setting sun, "I've built my cabin again. This time, I did it right. I did it the way you showed me." John turned to him, his expression kind but resolute. "We all build in different ways, Abram, but in the end, it's not the structure that defines us. It's the faith we place in it and in each other." Abram nodded, understanding at last the true depth of John's words. The two men stood together in silence, the wind quieting as the last of the winter's snow melted away. The storm had passed, but its lessons would remain for a lifetime. As the years went on, John Lapp's cabin became a place of pilgrimage for those who had heard of its story. People came from near and far, drawn by the simple wisdom of a man who had built for survival. And long after the fires had burned low and the snow had melted, the legacy of John Lapp's foolish chimney fix remained a symbol of faith, humility, and the quiet courage to build for the worst and hope for the best. The year turned, and with it the seasons began to shift, painting the fields with new shades of green. John Lapp stood outside his cabin in the warmth of early summer, watching as the wildflowers slowly reclaimed the land, their vibrant colors standing in stark contrast to the deep white of the winter past. The air, now thick with the scent of damp earth and fresh growth, carried with it a sense of renewal. The world was alive again, and so were the lessons learned through the trials of the harshest winter Lancaster County had seen in years. The community had rebuilt not just their homes but their understanding of what truly mattered in life. Gone were the days of cutting corners or rushing through tasks. Every man and woman in the township had learned the value of patience, preparation, and most importantly, community. It was a lesson John Lapp had known all along, one that had been passed down through generations of Amish faith and tradition. In the months that followed the storm, John had become more than just a carpenter. He had become a teacher, quietly imparting the wisdom that had kept him alive. Neighbors came to him, not just for advice on construction, but for lessons on life. How to build a stronger foundation, how to weather the storms, both literal and figurative. And through it all, John remained humble, never seeking attention, only wanting to ensure that the community would thrive. One afternoon, as John worked alongside his neighbor Abram, who had since become a close friend, he paused for a moment, taking in the peaceful sight before him. The new cabin they were constructing stood on the land where John had built his first home, now joined by others that had been built stronger, sturdier, and better prepared for the future. Abram set down his hammer, wiping sweat from his brow, and looked over at John. "You know, John," Abram began, "I never would have believed that all it took was a little patience and faith to make it through. I thought I knew what I was doing, but I didn't. You showed me what really matters." John smiled softly, looking out over the work they had completed. "It's not about the structure," he replied quietly. "It's about building something that lasts. A home that can stand through the storm, yes, but also one that can stand through the years. One that holds the memories, the love, the faith." Abram nodded thoughtfully, turning his eyes toward the horizon. "I see that now. I've built something that will last for my family, just as you did. And more than that, I've learned to build for them, for the future." John patted Abram's shoulder, his eyes glistening with a quiet pride. "That's all we can do, build for the future, no matter how uncertain it seems." As the years passed, the story of John Lapp and his foolish chimney became woven into the fabric of the community's history. His cabin stood as a beacon of resilience, a testament to the power of faith and preparation. But more than that, it stood as a reminder of the quiet strength that came from doing things the right way. even when the world seemed to rush toward shortcuts and temporary fixes. John never sought fame, nor did he ever ask for recognition. His reward had never been material, but in the way his community had grown stronger because of his actions. The men and women of Lancaster County had learned from his example. They had learned to build not just homes, but legacies. They had learned the value of patience, of taking the time to ensure that what they created would endure. And they had learned that sometimes, in the quietest moments, it was the simplest things that made the biggest difference. Years later, as John sat on the front porch of his cabin, now weathered and worn but still standing firm, he reflected on the journey that had brought him here. His hair had grayed, and his hands, once strong and sure, had begun to show the wear of age. Yet his heart remained as steady as it had been on the coldest nights of the storm, knowing that the work he had done, the chimney, the cabin, the decisions he had made had not only saved his life, but had given life to something far greater, a community built on trust, faith, and the willingness to prepare for the worst. One evening, as the sun set behind the hills and the light cast long shadows across the land, Abram Miller and his children arrived at John's cabin, just as they had many times before. Abram had brought his own son, now a young man, to visit John, to hear the stories and to understand the lessons that had been passed down. The generations had come full circle, with John's legacy living on not just in the wood of his cabin, but in the hearts of those who had been touched by his example. "John," Abram said, his voice thick with gratitude, "I came here today to show my son what real strength is, not the kind you see in a man's muscles, but the kind you see in his heart, the kind of strength that builds a future." John smiled, his eyes reflecting the warmth of the hearth. "Strength, Abram, is something we all carry. It's what we build with. It's what we leave behind, and it's how we shape the world for the ones who come after us." As the evening drew on, the cabin filled with laughter, stories, and the quiet hum of life moving forward. John Lapp's legacy would continue, not because of the structure he had built, but because of the strength of the values he had imparted. His cabin would one day be gone, as all things are, but the lessons it held would live on in the hearts of those who understood that true strength comes from humility, patience, and faith. The seasons turned again, each one carrying with it the subtle whisper of change. It had been many years since the fierce winter that had tested John Lapp and his neighbors. In the time that followed, the once small Amish community had grown, each new family bringing with them their own hopes, their own faith, and their own stories of perseverance. John's cabin, still standing strong and steady, had become a symbol of that perseverance, a living testament to what could be accomplished when a man built not for the moment, but for a lifetime. John had grown older with the years, his back a little more stooped, his hands a little slower, but his heart as full as ever. He still worked with the same quiet dedication, still took pride in the simple acts of everyday life. His garden flourished each summer. His barn stood tall through every storm, and his family remained his greatest treasure. But more than that, John had become a pillar of his community, the one people turned to when they needed guidance or just a moment of peace. On a crisp autumn evening, as the sun began to set behind the hills, casting the land in a golden glow, John stood outside his cabin, his gaze steady on the horizon. Abram Miller had passed away the year before, leaving behind a family that now looked to John as their anchor. Abram's son Jacob had become a close friend and confidant, someone John had mentored over the years. As John's hair turned more gray with the passing of time, Jacob had stepped into a new role within the community. He had learned well from the lessons John had taught, and now, as the older generation began to slip away, Jacob was ready to take the reins of leadership. John was proud of Jacob. He had watched him grow from a curious boy into a steady man. Jacob's hands were skilled, his mind sharp, and his heart full of the same quiet wisdom John had once held. It was no surprise to anyone that, as the community's need for leadership grew, Jacob became the natural choice to guide them into the future. But as John stood there, watching the evening sky, he realized that it wasn't just Jacob who would carry on the legacy, it was the entire community. The spirit of faith, humility, and perseverance that had been passed down to each new generation. The next morning, Jacob came to visit John as he often did. They sat together on the porch, sharing a pot of coffee and watching the children play in the yard. The air was cool, a sign that winter was on the way. But for now, the warmth of the sun provided comfort as they talked about the future. "John," Jacob said, breaking the silence, "I've been thinking a lot about what you've taught me over the years. I see the way people come to you for guidance, how they rely on you. I want to be that for them, but I'm not sure if I'm ready." John chuckled softly, his gaze still fixed on the horizon. "Jacob, you've been ready for a long time. It's not about being perfect. It's about doing what's right, even when it's hard. The community looks to you because you've already shown them the same quiet strength that helped us all survive." Jacob looked down, his hands resting on his knees, his expression thoughtful. "But there's so much more I need to learn." "You will," John said, his voice calm but firm. "It's not the knowledge you lack, Jacob. It's the understanding that it's okay to not have all the answers. Faith comes when you learn to trust in what's beyond you. Trust in God, in your community, in yourself. That's what will carry you through." Jacob nodded slowly, taking in John's words. "I'll do my best, John. I promise." "And that's all anyone can ask," John said, a warmth in his eyes. "You don't need to carry the weight of the world. Just carry the weight of those around you, and the rest will follow." As Jacob stood to leave, he turned back to John, a grateful smile on his face. "Thank you, John, for everything." John watched him go, feeling a sense of peace settle over him. His work was done. The community had learned its lessons, had built its foundations on faith and humility, and now it was ready to face whatever came next. The years passed more quickly than John had expected. As the seasons shifted once again, John's cabin, now standing with even more history behind its walls, seemed to grow quieter. The laughter of children had slowed, and the once bustling energy of neighbors stopping by for firewood or advice became a rare occasion. Yet through it all, the fire in the hearth burned steady, just as it had through every storm and every season of his life. It was a symbol, not just of warmth, but of endurance of the things that last beyond time, beyond generations. John's body, once strong and capable, had begun to fail him in small ways. His legs were stiff with age, and his back, once straight and proud, had grown hunched. But his spirit remained as steadfast as the cabin he had built, and his faith never wavered. He continued to wake early each morning, tending to his garden, feeding his chickens, and working the land that had provided for him and his family for so many years. His hands, though weathered and worn, still held the strength to do the work he loved. One late autumn evening, as the leaves began to turn and the first signs of frost dusted the ground, John knew that this would likely be his last winter. It wasn't the cold that he feared. He had long ago made peace with the winters that would come and go. It was the knowledge that his time on earth was drawing to a close, and that soon his place in the community would be taken by others. But as he sat on his porch, looking out over the land, he felt no fear. Instead, there was a deep sense of satisfaction. He had lived a good life, one full of purpose, and one that had mattered. He had built not just a cabin, but a legacy, a foundation for his community that would carry on long after he was gone. And as the first snowflakes of winter began to fall, John smiled softly to himself. The world had turned, and he had turned with it. Now, it was time to rest. In the weeks that followed, John's health slowly began to decline. His family gathered around him, and his neighbors, many of whom he had watched grow and thrive, came to visit, paying their respects to the man who had shown them how to endure, how to survive, and how to love. And in those final days, as John lay in his bed, his family by his side, he knew that his work was done. The legacy he had built was in good hands. As the snow blanketed the land outside, John Lapp passed quietly into the night, his heart full of peace. The cabin he had built, the chimney that had saved him, and the lessons he had imparted would live on forever, in the hearts of those who had been touched by his quiet strength.